Hello everybody and welcome to the 40th Theoretical Archaeology Group Conference. My role here is Professor of Archaeology at the University of Chester I'm one of the organisers, and all I'm doing is introducing the person who's doing the introduction. So I shall jump off stage after introducing one of the trustees of TAG, who's here to introduce the Antiquity Lecture, Professor Tim Darvill of Bournemouth University. Tim.
Well, thank you, Howard, and good evening to everybody. What a pleasure it is to come to a university that's relatively recently come to teach archaeology and deliver archaeological research, and what a delight it is to come to Chester, this delightful city. Well, as Howard says, TAG is in fact 40 years old this year. I think that itself is quite an achievement, and those who thought up the idea way back in the late 1970s, I think should take great pride in the fact that it's still going, still lively, and still attracting extremely large audiences interested in archaeological theory. I'd like to take you back to 1979, to one of the first programs. If we were here on December the 17th and 18th in the University of Sheffield, we'd have heard papers or sessions on land use and land boundaries, organised by Andrew Fleming, structuralist archaeology, organised by Ian Hodder. We'd have had a session on the long-run processes of socio-economic change, led by John Gledhill, and trade and complex societies, led by Richard Hodges. But there's one session that particularly tickled my interest. The very first session, at the very first TAG, was explaining away hunter-gatherer variability, organised by Clive Gamble. As far as I can see from the current TAG programme, the very first session, relational approaches to hunter-gatherer worlds. There we are. We've moved on a little bit over those 40 years. But absolutely fantastic. There's been thousands of sessions, thousands of participants, of course, dozens of parties, well, 40 at least, and lots and lots and lots of theory. It was at TAG in the early 1980s, of course, that the great processualist, post-processualist debate played out, and there have been many, many new ideas proposed, developed, demolished, challenged, and thought about since then. TAG has indeed spawned a family. There is now a TAG family, which includes US TAG, Turkish TAG, Iberico TAG. There's lots of tags, some of which have come and gone, but it's a family that's gradually extending across the world. Truly amazing. TAG is also incredibly simple, and I think it's the simplicity which has in many ways created its longevity. There's two trustees, Colin Renfrew and myself at the moment. Colin Renfrew sends his apologies. He told me there was far too much interesting things going on in Westminster to come up to TAG on this occasion. We'll leave you to make your own assessment of that. There is a national committee which meets once a year at the TAG meeting, and it's flagged up on the agenda for this meeting. And at that meeting, there are representatives from each of the various archaeology departments around the country that have either held TAG or which are hoping to hold TAG. Now, in the old days, we did used to hold a plenary session, and people used to make suggestions about how we could do things better in the future, which are always incredibly welcome. We tend not to hold those now because the departmental representatives gather up that information. And if you don't have a departmental representative, please do email myself with ideas and suggestions, and we will feed those into the committee and gradually move the whole thing forward. Well, in recent years, Antiquity has helped us a great deal with TAG. They've sponsored these lectures, which I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But if you have a look on their website, you'll also find the TAG website. And over the course of the last year, we've gathered together all of the previous programs and abstracts and as many of the posters and other pieces of literature that we can find. It's all been digitized, and it's all now available free through the Antiquity website. So do go and have a look at that. There's a fantastic archive of 40 years of TAG material to go and have a look at. And if you happen in your own collections to have stuff which is missing from there, and there are a few things missing, although we're not absolutely sure that they exist, do scan it, send myself or Rob Witcher a PDF, and it will join the assemblage, which is now securely tied, as I say, to the Antiquity website. So do have a look at that if you can. Now, as Antiquity sponsors this, it gives me great pleasure to open tonight's lecture and to introduce our speaker. There's a board advertising Antiquity reminding us of that here. No stranger to TAG, Cornelius Holtorf has studied archaeology and social anthropology and physical anthropology, and indeed many spheres of archaeology, uniquely in a number of different countries too, in Germany, in England, in Wales, and therefore he brings to us quite a unique European perspective on these things. He's since been working in Gothenburg, in Cambridge, and at the Swedish National Heritage Board, and since 2008, he's been at the Linnaeus University, where just recently he's taken on a UNESCO chair in Heritage Futures. Interesting title. Indeed, it's his interest in applying heritage to transform society that underpins much of his recent work and many of his recent publications, and of course lies behind what he's going to speak about tonight. His title, Applied Archaeology from Historical Development to Sustainable Development. Cornelius, come and take us away.
Thank you, Tim. When I sit in Sweden in the evenings and check the news on the internet, I'm astonished to see the utter disarray of British politics at the moment. And one can only wonder what the future will be of British politics. I don't think we have seen everything quite yet. But when I came here today, when I sat in the cab on my way to Chester, I thought, well, I can't possibly start the lecture with that. So I don't want to do that, because there are, of course, so many fantastic achievements that also come out of this country. And one of them, to me, has always been, and I think to many others, maybe all of you or most of you who are sitting here, is the incredibly innovative and creative and vibrant way in which archaeological theory has been practiced here over many decades. And to me, the one institution that embodies that spirit of theorizing and thinking, the one institution really is TAG. Because TAG attracts the wackiest of sessions. It's always focused on debate, on discussion, and it knows no status. Everybody talks to everybody else, and it doesn't matter what you do or where you're from or who you are. And that's quite wonderful. And I owe a lot to TAG myself. This is where I gave my first conference paper ever in the early 1990s. And this is also where I organized my first conference session ever. And so I'm very honored really to be given this opportunity here tonight to present some of my recent work. But I'd like to thank very much the committee and Chester, Howard and Caroline, and everybody who was part of the decision making for having me here. So it's very nice to be here, and I hope that TAG will have a long future to come. And that brings me to my topic. So I want to talk about applied archaeology from historical development to sustainable development. And the thesis I want to present here is that archaeology has always been, and also should be, not about understanding the past, but about making the future. It has always been a future-making discipline. Now, what do I mean by that? In order to illustrate this claim, first, I want to give you a very short history of archaeology as an applied archaeology for the future. So how has archaeology drawn on the past in order to try to make a future since its beginnings? And I'll be very broad, of course, and there's a lot more to be said about the history of archaeology, but I'll give you two themes that I think comprise most, at least, of what archaeology has seen over the past few centuries. So this is an account of how archaeology, in terms of historical development, is also about future making. The way in which the past has been told and researched has also been, for a long time, very close connections to a particular future that is envisioned. So let's start with a look, a short one, at National Romanticism, which is the intellectual framework within which the modern archaeology originated. And here the image you see is a postcard I bought many years ago in Denmark. And you see how this mix of prehistoric monuments, prehistoric artifacts, a national flag, the Danish flag, and even some royal symbols. So all this comes together and comes to stand in for the Danish nation. So this is a future that is not very specific. A nation like this may have origins, but it doesn't have an end. It's almost timeless. It's a very long-term vision of what it means, or what Denmark means, what the Danish identity is. And of course, many examples for this all around the world. When the nation states developed, and archaeology as a part of that also found its place in the modern state. Now up there you see an image, just had to put in a German reference, a famous quote from Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of the intellectuals driving the Nazi view of archaeology during the 1930s. And he wrote, you see this handwritten quote, if you can read it. The results of prehistoric research are the Old Testament of the German people. So you see, there's almost a religious context of that. It's so central in his view of what it means to be German that he makes this direct analogy to the Bible. It's so central for being German, and it's also so eternal. I mean, the Bible is timeless also, and so is this vision of the German state and of this particular version of nationalism. Of course, there's also a colonial aspect to that, and you may recognize the picture that's, even though it's small, it's Agatha Christie's detective novel, Murder in Mesopotamia. She was, of course, married to Max Mallowan and was many summers on excavations, and some of her work these experiences feature quite strongly, and this is the one which is actually set on an archaeological excavation in Mesopotamia. So here we see archaeologists working abroad in a colonial context and building up a particular archaeological system in other parts of the world. And of course, that's not specific to Britain. It's sometimes, as in this case, linked to wider imperial traditions. And in other cases, it's still part of what nationalism has meant throughout Europe and to some extent even outside of Europe. Now today, there are many institutions still in place. Many of the chairs in Germany, many of the institutions were actually founded during the 1930s, and they're still operating, even though in very different terms. But one of the things that has changed dramatically, and it is the reverse today, really, is that the aim of archaeology is no longer to colonize anybody or to impose the dominance of a particular national identity on anybody else. But it can be seen even in terms of cultural diplomacy. And I remember some years ago, at the time, the president of the German Archaeological Institute talked about the significance of conducting work in Mesopotamia at the time, because the Germans also have a tradition of schools in several of these countries. And for him, this was a matter of cultural diplomacy. It was about building contacts, building friendships, finding a way into another nations and building on that. And it's still significant that the German Archaeological Institute is still part of the foreign ministry in Germany. So it's nothing to do, or at least the governance is not about science or education, but it's about foreign policy. And of course today for very respectable aims and goals. I think that's an interesting way in which some traditions persist and others, the goals certainly have changed. Now, another example for how we are today have moved beyond nationalism is or at least trying to move beyond nationalism, is the United Nations. Now, that's an attempt to bring all the nations together and to find common ground, emphasizing human rights, for example. things that are important for all nations in the world. And one part of the United Nations is UNESCO, and the most successful convention of UNESCO is the World Heritage Convention. I don't need to introduce that because I'm sure all of you have heard of that. So that's an attempt in our sector to designate heritage sites for the sake of peace, because the aim of the World Heritage Convention is, of course, to bring people together and to appreciate cultural diversity around the globe, and to support understanding and collaboration on a global scale. Now, there are many problems with this view of archaeology as part of a national romanticist perspective. And one of them is obviously that the world looks very differently today. And we live no longer in a world where the nation states are the most important things, but we live in a global way, in a global world, and we know that the economy, for example, doesn't respect borders very much, but everything depends on everything else. We know that the environment is the same around the world, and what happens in one area will affect what happens in another area. We've seen all kinds of migrations going on for a long time, and not only to Europe, but also in different parts of the world. From Southern Africa is taking a lot of people from Asia, and all sorts of other movements are going on. And even in culture, there are a lot of examples of Hollywood films or other popular culture also that we all share, or most of us share around the world, irrespective of where we are. 2 years ago, I was in Botswana, and we went to a movie, and it was the most American experience one can imagine. There was like no difference anymore, and it just brings it home, how we've all grown together and how everything sort of starts to resemble everything else. So that's one of the problems of nationalism. But there are also problems with the supposed way to counter that, with what the United Nations is doing, because the United Nations to some extent is still stuck in the national paradigm, and it's very difficult. You see this in the news, Security Council and so on. It's still difficult to overcome national agendas, and of course it's not set up to do that, because it is the United Nations, as the title says. And in the World Heritage Connection, what you see is that people are competing for a number of heritage sites. This is just, you don't need to read the figures, or in fact, all the countries. But it shows the sort of statistics that matter today. And it shows, this is quite, I think it's either this year or last year, it's quite recent, that Italy is ahead of China with only one heritage site at the moment. And presumably this will change next year when China comes to the front. And this is the outcome of a very long campaign and a lot of work in China to get there, because I think this is where they should be. And I don't have views on where any country should be in this list, but it still is perceived as a contest between different nations. And there are a lot of nations who put an incredible amount of resources into applications for the World Heritage Site. And there are lots of deals between different nations that if you support mine, I support yours. And the whole point is just to have more sites than somebody else, or to have more in a particular region on a particular country. And of course, that's not how it was intended originally, but that's the way it has become. And that's also deeply problematic. So here we have a future that is almost timeless, implied in this idea of archaeology contributing to the national view, to national identity and national romanticism. And characteristically, of course, also the World Heritage Convention, there is no normal procedure of how a site can lose the status as a World Heritage Site. It has happened twice under very special circumstances, but it's not a normal thing to happen. That's why it just keeps increasing ever more. Originally, I understand it was meant to have about 200 or 300 sites on the list, and now it's around 1,100 at the moment. It keeps growing because more and more countries want to be represented in it, or want to climb up higher on this list. Right, but there's a second major paradigm in which archaeology has been practiced, also for a long time by now, and I want to call that It's the paradigm here of edutainment and customer appeal, because archaeology is very popular and it attracts customers in different contexts, and it amuses people also in very different ways. And I put here the first line is World Heritage and mass tourism, because that's one context within which we see that. World Heritage sites are supposed to attract tourists. That's the main motivation in many parts of the world, even if less so in Europe. And they do that. There are travel companies that bring people from various parts of the world to see a number of World Heritage sites. And this is big business in some areas. Now, I wrote a book many years ago now, which was called Archaeology is a Brand, and it was all about why archaeology is attracting audiences. And I argued that archaeology is a process, that it's an exciting process. It's about finding things and interpreting things and discovering things and so on. And we see everything from Lara Croft to Indiana Jones becoming mainstream culture. And still today, people recognize, they know what the brand of archaeology stands for, and they tend to love it in most circumstances. And archaeology can be an inspiration for people. You can accept, for example, Indiana Jones as a role model, as somebody inspiring maybe your own aspirations in life. And this is one of the wonderful cartoons of Quentin Drew, who illustrated the book I just mentioned. And I can't read it myself. If you can, fine. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Storytelling in archaeology is an important part of it. Archaeology is all about telling stories on where have you been, or what have you found, or did you find any gold and skeletons, and so on. And that in itself can inspire people to in various realms. And I've gone on to argue that archaeology can be seen in terms of enchantment. It adds another dimension to life and to our reality that is quite inspiring in many ways, and that is sort of half real. It lies beyond the everyday. It's something you have to, which lies below the surface, something you have to discover, and which it tells you, in the best case, something really interesting and unexpected, maybe, about history and about our world. Now, in this perspective, you may think, what sort of future perspective do we have here? Well, a much shorter one. This can be an economic future, which is extremely short. It can just be a few months or a few years ahead, or it can be an individual future. I think the Indiana Jones metaphor is definitely is connected to the person. So it's about our own futures. What do we want to achieve in life? Which adventures do we want to get into, or what do we want to? How do we want to get out of the stories we start? So this is a much shorter future, but it's still something that we see ahead of us. It's still something that we work for, something that we want to realize in one way or another. And of course, there are problems with this perspective too. One of them is that people speak about over-tourism now. There's too much tourism, at least in some parts of the world. If you think of Amsterdam or Venice or Barcelona, I'm sure there are many other sites like this, where it becomes a problem that there's a conflict between mass tourism and where people stay for a weekend and don't really have time or inclination to get to know the local places in any detail. And on the other hand, you have the local population who feels more and more alienated from their own cities or their own places, partly for economic reasons, because with Airbnb and so on, the rent prices go up. And partly because they're just in the minority, at least in certain locations, and feel completely overwhelmed by that. So it can be too much on occasions. And I would also say that as I look back now about what I wrote at the time, what I wasn't very good at, and one could say what is missing, is that there isn't really a very strong societal perspective I had in mind at that time. This is all about individuals and about users in the present, and about various sort of benefits one can imagine, but it is not about improving society, at least not in any major way. So I've been thinking about how could this be added, and where might we be going if we are thinking about archaeology in the future. into a different direction that is also about the future, but it takes on board the needs and interests of society a bit more. So do we need a new agenda for archaeology, or do I need a new agenda in my archaeology? That's sort of what I want to talk about now for the next bit. And I want to first say a few things about archaeology and sustainable development, because this is a different paradigm now that moves away from the idea of historical development, from the both from the Indiana Jones, who finds things from the past and tells adventures about what he gets up to and how it, and where the artifacts, or if they might end up in a museum or not. And it's also different from the story about the origins of a nation, for example, or other historical stories. This is a completely different kind of development here. This is a development that is directed at the future. So let me take you through this in 4 parts. The Agenda 2030 is something that you will have heard about before, and I have these wonderful images, 17 goals. And again, this is something the United Nations decided on a few years ago, and it's something that every member state of the United Nations signed up to this. This is a collective agenda for humanity until 2030. And that's why it's important, because there are not so many things we've all together agreed we would be doing. And the United Nations describes this list in these terms. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are the world's best plan to build a better world for people and our planet by 2030. So a future perspective 15 years ahead from the time when it was decided on. And in this list, there is one reference to cultural heritage. And this is being built within UNESCO as a major success, because behind this lies lobbying for several decades that there's one explicit reference. And it's also it's one of 2 references to culture and the only reference to cultural heritage. And that's one of the targets in the game, in goal 11, sustainable cities and communities. The conservation of natural and cultural heritage, which is supposed to make a contribution to sustainable cities and communities. And that's where a lot of focus is on at the moment within UNESCO, on trying to make, to show how heritage can make these contributions and how, what sort of evidence there is in order, with the aim that culture will play a bigger role in the future. In the next list, because the post-2030 agenda, when it will come, hopefully will answer, or what we should answer now, what people are working on is how can the potential of culture to contribute to global development become more visible in this framework. And there are many aspects in this list, many of the goals where archaeology could make a contribution. For example, if you look at here, goal number 3, good health and well-being. There's a lot of work in the UK, but also in other countries where projects have been set up that show how there are clear health benefits of patients, of old people who work with material culture, with different activities connected to archaeology and to heritage. That is no longer unique, but there's a whole body of evidence growing. And one could capitalize even more on this potential, in which case we get a whole different story on what archaeology might do in society. It's no longer about learning about the past or about education in any way, but this is a whole different agenda. Now, I just mentioned learning. This is the, where am I? Yeah. The goal number 4 up here. And of course, learning is about many different things. And in one way, we've all worked with learning for a long time in archaeology and public education. But it's also to do with something that's known as the generic learning outcomes, GLOs. And even here, archaeology can make a contribution, because that is about defining an interest, being curious to find out something, defining a strategy and how to learn something. And this is something that can rescue people that have lost the path in a way, people who have dropped out from schools, people who may be offenders, and Caroline Putney has been writing on a project like this in the last issue of Public Archaeology. One example from what happens here in Chester in that direction. So here we see that the potential of archaeology doesn't lie in that people understand better what happened in the Neolithic or in any other period, but it may lie in that people gain interest in learning, that they take responsibility for gaining skills, which has an impact on their lives and brings them back into society in a different role, than in a different position than where they may be today. Again, a very different agenda for archaeology than what we may be used to. And one could go on like this. There are many of the other goals also where archaeology could make a contribution. So this is something that people at UNESCO are working on. And it's something where archaeology can and should make a contribution, I think. Now I want to give you another example for how we are working at Linnaeus University at the moment. This is a future. This is not, it's not even 2030. This is a project where we're working together with contract archaeology, with several 5 companies in contract archaeology. And their time perspective is maybe 5 to 10 years ahead, which is still amazingly long in that sector. But they are prepared to part finance. We have now 10 PhD students who will complete their research after 5 years because they're not working full time. At that time, the companies want to be able to develop new services, new products on the basis of that research. So this is something that does take some time, and they are prepared to work with us on this. So the aim of this research school with 10 PhD students is capacity building and increasing the competitiveness for archaeological companies 5 to 10 years ahead. And you notice the language I'm using here. So we're talking about growth and competitiveness and market and so on, all these terms. And that doesn't mean we think that as a value in itself in using these terms, or that we necessarily embrace everything that these terms are associated with in the media or whatever. No, but it means that we can communicate to people who want to give us money to support such efforts. And in Sweden, it's a very big foundation known as the Knowledge Foundation. And their role is, their task is that they support the competitiveness of Swedish industry. And we are the first research school that got that sort of money for the humanities. Because we use that language, and we can show how contract archaeology can increase its competitiveness and open up new markets based on basically a better way, or a more developed way of public archaeology, because we think there are more demands in society. There's more areas where archaeology can make a contribution, where archaeologists do have skills that are valuable. For example, health, that I mentioned before. And the topics they're working with, they're not all necessarily completely unique for our research school, but these, the attempt is not to come up with something nobody else has thought about before. The aim of this project is to develop research so that companies can develop services on the basis of it. So there are academic criteria for this research, but there are also criteria to make it applicable. So this is, for us, an example of applied archaeology. We want that the companies can find customers who will need this, these skills and this competence that our students are working on. So in 3 cases, just 3 examples. One is working with planning. We think that archaeology can play a stronger role in planning, in the very planning process itself, not only having to deal with the outcome of what others have been planning. Forensic archaeology is not a new field, but it's not something that archaeological companies in Sweden have services in. And we try to develop that with one company. And we're also trying to expand knowledge on digital innovations so that they become applicable, that we can do things for people, and there's a market where people will demand that sort of expertise. So here we're talking about a future, a development perspective that is sort of 5 to 10 years ahead. And that's, of course, slightly less than the 2030 perspective I gave you earlier. So let's look a little bit at something that is slightly more than the 2030 perspective. Nuclear waste is arguably the archaeological, or part of the archaeological heritage of the very long-term future. And we've been working with the Swedish nuclear waste sector for 7 years now in different contexts. And this is an image of what the Swedish final repository of nuclear waste is supposed to look like once the planning permission is given and they start building. And that could be very soon, then the final phases of this application process. And it will only be the second country in the world that has a permit to build such a repository. The first country is Finland, and Sweden will be the second. So you see how this looks like, almost like an Egyptian tomb, like treasures below the surface that we all hope nobody will find, or if they find it, they know what they're doing. So the archaeological expertise this lies that we're trying to anticipate human behavior in the future. And of course, they are also trying to do that, but they're doing this from an engineering perspective. They're like thinking what happens if people come from the top or from the sides, if they with that much force, or and what happens with the geology in certain time periods. There are lots of studies on that already. But we are thinking in terms of interpretation, and in terms of how do we address people in 100,000 years from now, if we can even speak of people in that context. I mean, Homo sapiens is maybe 200,000 years old, something like that. But 100,000 years ahead, who are we talking to? Even that doesn't seem so clear. You've probably seen Planet of the Apes. And do you remember what the archaeologist is called in Planet of the Apes? Cornelius. This is the sort of, now this is an easy example for how not to communicate to the future. It just shows you the kind of thinking. So this is not a realistic attempt to communicate 100,000 years ahead. But it shows the difficulties, because all of these symbols are, of course, only meaningful in a particular cultural context. And the skull and bones, for example, may represent death, but in the Baroque period, it represented whole different connotations of that. And for young boys, it may represent pirates, and it's very exciting. So it's unclear what it means. There are 3 levels on which you have to work if you're dealing with this challenge. One is, which materials do you choose so that it will actually survive over 100,000 years? And that's far from certain. And there are not many materials that one can think of directly that will last. But maybe that can be solved with the help of material science and other sort of technical expertise. But the second challenge is, in which language do you communicate? Because people are unlikely to understand English in 100,000 years, or Chinese, or Latin, or whatever. Or symbol language. I mean, that's already today not understandable to most people on the planet. So one idea they have is that you create a little Rosetta Stone. So you have the same text in 3 or 4 different languages. And the idea is that researchers in the future will be able to work it out if they can compare between different languages, what it might say. But that's the best they've come up with at the moment. And of course, it doesn't solve the third problem that is also there, because this is even if people have the object and even if they can read the words, does that mean that they act as is intended? Or will they become extra curious, for example, and interested in finding out whether that's true, or find any kind of reason to dig down there and see what they had? So there are many issues with that. And this is what we're working with in the nuclear sector. And one of the things that we can learn as archaeologists, and in fact as heritage people, from the way the nuclear waste sector has approached this question, is that we take the future seriously. Now, in January, I'll be addressing an audience in Paris at the OECD, and they're all nuclear waste people. So there I don't need to make any apologies for thinking 100,000 or 1 million years ahead. This is normal for them. They're used to that. It's part of their education. For us, it seems rather weird. And of course, archaeology maybe doesn't have to deal with such long time periods. We can think in shorter dimensions. So if this is one thing we can learn from the nuclear waste sector is in realizing the need to address the future, an explicit future, and also to develop research on how to address these questions that need to be solved concerning the future. Then there's also something that we need to tell to the nuclear waste sector that they're not used to, that they're not expecting maybe or don't like to hear. And it is, of course, important in all academic research that you have a critical perspective and that you challenge things that where more perspectives need to be heard, and maybe you don't agree with the proposal that is on the table. And one of the baselines, one of the assumptions in a lot of at least in the public domain debates about sustainability, is that it seems to assume you create conditions that last for very long time periods, that don't need to be renewed, that are so well thought through, like renewable energy, that they can continue indefinitely in the future. And that's exactly the way in which the nuclear waste sector works, because they've understood, and in fact they have legal obligations to solve this problem. And most of them, or many of them, are engineers. So they're used to define the problem, and I'll make sure I'll get a solution for you. So the problem is that this stuff is dangerous in for at least 100,000 years. So let's solve it somehow. Let's dig it really in the right place, really deep down, and employ the archaeologists to have a communication strategy and so on. So for them, it's about, and for the lawmakers, because they will only give permission for building these sites if they are confident that this is the solution that has the best chances to work. It will provide the sort of security and safety that is necessary. But of course, what this forgets is that things change over time. And that's what is common understanding, of course, in our sector. That's what archaeology and history and other historical disciplines are all about, recognizing change. Now here you see one of the missing Buddha statues in Afghanistan. And why do I show this image? Because it represents how people in archaeology, in some context, have this same debate. Just over a year ago, I was in Tokyo at a meeting convened by UNESCO and in collaboration with the Afghan government, and the culture minister of Afghanistan was also there. And it became very clear that not necessarily everybody, but quite a few people from Afghanistan who were part of this meeting, they were interested in rebuilding at least one of the Buddhas to put history right again, to show that the Taliban tried, but at the end of the day, they didn't succeed. We rectify this error of history, and we create something that will from now on last for all time into the future. And of course, that's not feasible, really, from this perspective, to implement something that will last forever. History hasn't stopped. And if any discipline, then it's archaeologists' account of historical development, which shows that viable, sustainable development is not about establishing practices that can last forever, but it is rather about improving resilience, which is the capacity of future generations to absorb change. So, a site like the Buddhas and probably any other heritage site, even in Britain or wherever we may be, is not any kind of evidence that things were created at some point and then maintained and now conserved, maybe as World Heritage into the future. But rather they are manifestations of constant change over time, how people adapted to changing circumstances, put these sites or the artifacts and buildings to new uses, and absorbed the changes with the help of these monuments or collections. So if anything, then what we can learn about long-term development and how we can become more resilient, and it is about increasing our capacity to absorb change that is necessary. And that's the understanding that is missing in the nuclear waste sector. because they need to build, what I would say in Paris is that they need to think of processes that incorporate change, and they will need to think of solutions. How can we help future generations to absorb change? How can we help them to make sure that whatever the site will mean in the future, however this maybe what we call nuclear waste, however they will call it, however they will want to use it, how can we make sure, or at least do the best we can, that they will not get into a dangerous situation, expose themselves to radiation that they may not know about in certain circumstances. So that's quite a different challenge than from putting it safely away below the surface for all time. And I think this is one of the lessons that we can take from archaeology, that it is about change and not about preservation and conservation. Right. So this then, my account of sustainable development in these 4 steps, of course there are many other things one could also say about it, is trying to describe a new agenda for an applied archaeology that is about the future, not about the past, because all these aspects here are addressing more or less directly the future and future needs of people, even though the time scale varies quite a bit between them. And of course, that aspect that is of the future, this paradigm shares with what I was saying earlier about the origins of archaeology and sort of 2 dominant paradigms that we've seen in the history of archaeology. So, my final part is about what does all this mean for archaeological theory, because this is tag. And we should think at least a little bit about what are the implications of that, how we should be thinking ahead, how we should be conceptualizing the discipline and our work in it. What sort of ideas do we need in order to take on these challenges of the future? Is there an intellectual agenda? Well, something provocative. Maybe we have come long enough in our inquiries about archaeological ontologies and also about specific conditions of life in various periods, because we've come far. There are loads of debates and have been for decades on both of these aspects, on epistemology and ontology and what archaeology is and how it works, but also on all sorts of details on prehistoric and historic societies and how they lived and yeah, a lot of things that occurred at that time. So this is not something, this is something that we have control of. We may not know everything, and of course we can improve that also and get further. But here we have a base of knowledge already. But where we know less, it's not completely new, but where we could need more research is on what do archaeology and archaeological heritage do in society, and what's the potential? What could they do in society? And I would argue provocatively also that maybe heritage studies and UNESCO are ahead of the game in that respect. Maybe not in every respect, but in that respect, I think there is work that has already started and has been for some years into that direction, and archaeologists have maybe been slow in catching up on this. Here's just one of the illustrations that is very that you may have seen many times before. It's a sort of common illustration of sustainable development, and it's 4 dimensions: the environmental, economic, social, and cultural dimension. And if you could read the small print there, then you see key terms at the between these 4 dimensions. And many of them are, of course, cultural landscape, for example. That's not a new term. There are many of these aspects that are already researched, that are established terms. But the relationships between them, that's where I think we would need to, or we could do more research, and both heritage studies and UNESCO have started doing that. So how does, for example, the cultural landscape context contribute both to the cultural and the environmental versions of sustainable development? And the same applies to all the other terms that are sort of at the that are connected to at least one and sometimes several of these spheres of sustainable development. I think this would be an agenda that is very explicitly directed at the future and at development questions, and it links to things like the Agenda 2030. Yeah, as I said, I think archaeologists may have prioritized a bit too much research about historical development and not enough research about sustainable development in all these different dimensions. So I would argue that more research is needed in archaeology, realizing its potential as a social science, making a difference for future generations. Now, it's not that there's no work about this, but the work that exists comes from heritage studies, or it is in reports from which UNESCO is collecting at the moment and has also been doing for some time, because they are in the political struggle. They are trying to persuade politicians and people who run the economy and so on. They need to be persuaded with figures that it is beneficial to invest in culture and to realize the potential of the cultural disciplines, including archaeology, to make a difference to human development into the future. I think we could have more of that even in archaeology. You may wonder, how can this be done? How can all this future research be done when the future hasn't happened yet? Because that seems to be a main difference to the past. And of course, that is the big question. How do we approach the future? How do we know what people will need and what our contribution might be to that? Now, sometimes there are already references to the future in heritage context. Strikingly, as in this case, oops, sorry. No. Now you get seasick after all. There we go. Can you read this? Now this is a mosque in Delhi, and it says the Ahmad Khana Mosque. And what it says on this is ensuring preservation for the next 700 years. So when I went there, I thought, oh, I can't quite believe that. What sort of future-directed vision do they have? That's pretty impressive, that they are restoring a heritage site for 700 years. What do they know about the future that I don't know? So I started asking and looked at their web pages and so on. And what transpired is that at the end of the day, it's nothing but a reference. Where does it say? It says somewhere at the top. Can't see it, I don't know, that the mosque is from the 13th century. So just a mirror image. It's 700 years old. So that's why it should be preserved for 700 years to come. That's all there is to it. They have no vision of what will happen in 700 years for which they need this mosque or anything else. So I think we can do better than that. And we need to do better than that. How can we plan for the future? And I want to give you 4 lessons from what I've learned to date on how people in other disciplines, how people in futurology, for example, think about the future. And this is not all that advanced. This is more or less a summary of what is already out there. But it's not discussed in archaeology. And I think it should be. And not just discussed, but should also be taken advantage of in our discipline. So lesson number 1. Don't make too many assumptions based on our own time. And I think that's the most obvious lesson you can give. And yet it's also the hardest to avoid, because we are living in our time and it's difficult to think in different terms than in our own. And of course, this is also the way in which the nuclear waste sector is thinking ahead, because they are thinking that nuclear waste in 100,000 years will be the same as what it is today. And people will also need to be afraid of it, and they will have exactly the same challenges with it that we have today. And yet we know that the only thing we can say about the future is that it will be different from the present, and we cannot take for granted that our terms, our concerns will be valid at that time. Human history is not about to end. Of course not. History always goes on, and we are not outside of history, whoever we are and whatever we do. There's a tendency that future generations are infantilized, that they're being treated as if they were small children. That we sort of, we make some important, we invest some resources and we make some important decisions that they may not like it immediately, they may not understand why we conserve this building for them or why we keep this collection for future generations, But eventually they will be grateful to us. Eventually they will understand that we were not like our parents and great-parents who destroyed so much of their heritage. We will take care of as much as possible, and eventually they will be thankful to us. And of course that's a very patronizing way of looking at the future. And if we look at children not as small children, but if we look at them as teenagers, then we understand that, yes, they will not necessarily be thankful for everything we do for them, but they will go their own way, and they will be just as competent as we were, and they will be able to make their own decisions in the future, and we will also be accepting them, and everybody will. And it doesn't mean that everything is going downhill and the world will no longer exist. No, it just means there will be change, and they will create their own world, and they will go further. And that's not news to anybody, of course, but I think we should take it on board in a different way, in the way we plan for the future, in the way we make decisions about conservation, for example. We can trust in change, because change is inevitable, and change always happens. And we trust in change in our families. We accept that our children will live differently in some way than we do, and do different things and have different priorities. Not entirely, but to some extent. And if we think about several generations ahead, there will be different people, and we may not even recognize them very much from us. There's a wonderful quote here by Steve Fuller from 2013, which expresses this sentiment, this point I want to make. You can be sure that if a model says the world will end in 50 years, the model itself will be gone in 25. So nothing lasts, even our predictions don't last. So let's accept that. Let's work with that. Let's try to absorb change, however possible. Let's think ahead about a future that is not like the present. My second lesson is the opposite. Because we know more about the future than you think. It's not completely different what we can expect. Okay, maybe in 100,000 years we don't know so much about that. But that's not the time perspective we need to have in archaeology. Here are some trends for up to 50 years ahead. This is not my speculation. This is basically a summary of what I've read, what other people are doing. And it's, you know, there are lots of people, consultants who travel from one business to the other and telling them what to think for the future. And they are all more or less saying the same thing. These are all what they call mega trends that are there, that have already started, that we're already seeing, and that are not really very controversial, at least not on that sort of quite general level. Demography. Many people who will be living in 50 years are already born. We know there will be more people than today. We know that most will live in Asia. We know that there will be many more 60 plus because people live longer and have healthier lives, and there will be more active in high age. We know that people will live in cities, and we know that there will be migrations. Now that doesn't mean we know every detail on this. We don't know if there may be different reasons for migrations. There may be different geographical areas, of course, where people will move to. But it will always be, there will be a fluctuation of populations between different areas. So these are things we know. Technology, artificial intelligence. I mean, you probably also read in the media that self-driving cars, this is something that we will see very shortly. They're already experimenting with that, which you've probably also read about. And this is only the beginning. The whole industry is investing a lot of money, different industries, in artificial intelligence in all kinds of realms. We don't know exactly what this will do, but a lot will happen in our lifetime in that field. We know about digitalization, and we may start wondering about post-digitalization, whatever that may mean. But the people who are champions of digitalization at the moment, and there are many of them, and also in our sector, they don't often ask about how do they prepare themselves for the time after digitalization. Now, I don't know when that is, and I don't know exactly what that could mean, but that's not my area of specialty. I just wonder how they think about that, how they're planning for something that will come, even though I don't know when, and I don't know what it might involve. But this is another thing that is obvious to us. Economy, it's a global world, everything hangs together. We know there will be new centers. At the moment we are looking to China, but also India, big countries, a lot of populations that are investing a lot of innovation at the moment. And it also comes with a risk of collapse. We have already seen one economic crisis. There will be more. I don't know when or where they will start and what the exact consequences will be, but there will be catastrophes also in that category. Environment, we're already seeing many changes, and there will be more, both in climate and connected to that in land use all around the world. And also in society. This is the one thing that you don't read very often about in the economic literature on the future. They have a blind eye on that a little bit. But economic, social, and cultural divisions in society will also persist in one way or another. Now, some may become smaller and others may become bigger, and there may also be regional variations and all kinds of things that we may not be able to predict in detail. But there will always be issues with that and challenges to address. So what I'm asking is, how can archaeology contribute to development in such a world? And that's the research that I don't see. What potential do we have to provide services for more people that are 60 plus? And these will be large numbers, more than 60 plus. Or for people who live in cities. Archaeology is often rural, and of course there are good reasons why. But people will live in the cities, and they will live in Asia. So this is where innovation is needed. This is where research is needed. What do we do in order to provide services in such a world? And you could argue similarly for all the other points. How do we get ready for a world that we sort of, at least in broad terms, can see already emerging in front of our eyes? Lesson 3. Specific future scenarios can help. This is a method that is well established in different disciplines, but hardly in archaeology and hardly even in cultural heritage. This is a Swedish study about 5 future scenarios for 2050, the conditions for agriculture and land use. Now, this is how the Swedish Agricultural University is contributing to this challenge in an agricultural context. In an urban planning context, this time in English, there was a project a few years ago in Stockholm at KTH, and it was called Postcards from the Future. And this is a view of Stockholm in 2015, just a street view in the center of Stockholm. And what they did is they designed 3 scenarios: a techno city, also 2050. A techno city, an eco city, and a market city. And in each case, they thought about what might that mean for this street scene. How will the buildings look? How much greenery will there be? What about cars and transport? Where will people be? And so on. Now, I'm wondering, should we not do similar sort of scenarios for heritage and archaeology in the future? What is our role in this or in other scenarios that might happen? And it doesn't mean we can predict. It's not that any of these scenarios will become reality. No, but we can learn about ways to think the future, but ready for variation, ready for different scenarios, build competence in the sector, so that's something that will help us to plan for the future and be ready for when it comes. Right, and my last lesson is we may need to rethink archaeological practices. And that's maybe most concrete. That's why it comes at the end. This is the first one. The future is not what it used to be. Because the future, nothing is more difficult to predict than the past, and nothing ages faster than the future. You know these insights. Does archaeological education need a best before date? I think it does. Certainly when I studied, it was in the early 90s. It was all about processualism and post-processualism. And I was very hot at the time. And a lot of people in my generation, especially those who are not at the universities and maybe working in other sectors, and who sometimes want to make a contribution to archaeology or publish something, they are still caught in that framework. They think the world hasn't moved. The theory is still in these dichotomies that existed, several decades ago. And isn't that natural? Because when you do, you can't always keep up with the literature in every field all the time. And yet things happen everywhere. So shouldn't we make it more normal that the archaeological education, the courses you go, they last maybe 20 years or something like that. Or maybe different courses could have different best before dates. And then you need to have some sort of update, some sort of professional development, really, to what has happened since, or where do we stand today? I think that would be really beneficial and would help us to update our own knowledge and to understand that certain things have changed since when we were educated, and that it doesn't require us to die for changes to happen and for new paradigms to emerge, as sometimes seems to be the case. The second lesson is that the path can be the goal. Is the practice of archaeology as important as its academic results are? Well, the point has been made many times that there are benefits in archaeological practice that are significant for example, for social cohesion, that it brings people together. It means they work together, they achieve something together, they get a sense of community. And that can be very beneficial in urban contexts, but also in all kinds of contexts where people who don't get on with each other suddenly achieve something together. It can be part of team building initiatives also, for example. But why do we always think this is sort of secondary? The real aim of archaeology is to produce knowledge about the past, or maybe to conserve archaeological finds, or a bit of both. Why don't we say that the practices, what we actually do, and what that does in society and with people, that this is just as important, maybe more important in certain circumstances. Maybe it's not, if we think about meeting some of these aims about which I mentioned in the Agenda 2030 list, or among the other examples I gave, that maybe it's the practices especially that have a potential to make a contribution. Health, for example, it really doesn't matter which period the artifact is from that you give to somebody to handle or so. It's completely immaterial. That's not immaterial, but it's not important. So why not put this center stage, the practices of archaeology, and investigate them properly and systematically in all their richness? And they are very rich. Archaeology has very many methodologies and does a great many different things in different specialisms, as you know. And then finally, it takes two to tango. How can archaeology contribute to empowering future generations? How can we make archaeology more people-centered? People-centered in the same sense that the Agenda 2030 is a people-centered agenda. It's not about things or about abstract values. It's about people's interests and what is considered to be what they need. And the same you can say in archaeology, that normally we think that we produce knowledge which we want to preserve, of course, in libraries and so on, and we conserve monuments and collections that we want to be available in the future so people can link their identities to it, they can apply all kinds of values that they may have, they can maybe construct their identity in those terms, and so on. This is the way we're thinking at the moment. But if we're interested in the effects on people that archaeology has, then I think we should put these effects, make it more people-centered, put these effects at the center, or at least as much as at the center as the other things. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, if we want that people in the future make the right ethical decisions. Maybe we think, and I would probably support that, maybe we think that ethics is one of the areas that really needs to be developed more for the future, because there will be a number of far-reaching developments. Artificial intelligence is only one of them, but we're not quite sure how we should react, and where we need to have higher the competency of people at that time. Maybe that should be one outcome of archaeology in the future. But for that, we don't need to have a certain body of knowledge about the past. We don't need to have a certain body of monuments from the past preserved that tells us a story about the past, that manifests historical development or academic methodology in one way or another. Now, what we would need is that sort of knowledge and that sort of collection of artifacts that stimulates ethical thinking, that provokes people to ask the right questions, and maybe also to question dominant authorities. And that's quite a different criterion that you would need to apply on how you work and what knowledge you produce and what you conserve. Because maybe it's not about representing the past. Maybe it's about stimulating people to think in a particular way. So I'm trying to turn the picture from the objects we're dealing with and the knowledge we're producing to the people who are using them, and to what we hope or intend future people to be able to, and what we want to strengthen, and how we want to empower future generations. And that's quite a different topic, and it may need different priorities. Right, so these are my implications. This is sort of a very incomplete and very probably incoherent, but nevertheless, half original agenda for what kind of thinking may be needed. That, yes, it has started, and yes, it's not completely new, but I think this could deserve a lot more studies, a lot more systematic research in the future. So here we go. That's my argument. Archaeology has always been and should be not about understanding the past, but about making the future. But the two big paradigms that I've identified for the past may need to be complemented with another one that is connected to the Agenda 2030, but also to very long-term questions like nuclear waste. And if you're interested and want to find out more about all these ideas and various projects that are ongoing, look up the Heritage Futures project, which is a project based at UCL and directed by Rodney Harrison. And we're now in the final stages of that. It will end next spring, and there's a lot of material available on all kinds of heritage and future thinking. So that's one place. And the other place, if you can read it, is the homepage of the chair on Heritage Futures, where we also, this is not as also, there's not as much material, but growing all the time, putting out information on papers and ideas and events and so on. So find out more on those places if you like. Thank you very much.